Hi, everyone. Hello. Thanks for coming to this session. I am the technical lead, and our wonderful chair of the session is online, so this is very fancy. So Emma Gordon is going to take over. So my job is just to tell you we're starting, so you can finish talking, and then we have our technician in the back controlling the sound, so we might need to get a little bit adjusted. We have Felix and Maggie in the room, and everyone else will be remote. So Emma, you're hearing me, right? Yeah. Okay, so Emma, I'm going to let you take over. Is that all right? Yep. So we're going to adjust the volume. We had it down low. We haven't been able to get rid of the Sean Reese part, who is the boss technician. So that might have to stay there at least until the technician figures out how to make it go away. But okay, so I think we're ready for the voices online to get a lot louder, please.
You guys backstage. I can't hear her now.
This is apparently not true.
Is it worth us going back to backstage then?
Okay, so I'll go in the back and send them a chat that they're on.
Let me go backstage to see if anyone can, if they can hear me when I'm in the backstage mode, rather than every back and forth.
Good job that it's a long session, isn't it?
Yes.
Go on and rock and
Felix, maybe you and I should just start talking.
Okay, right. Welcome everybody. Hopefully you can hear me on stage. I'm Emma Gordon. I'm chairing this panel today on what future data services look like. And I'm doing this because I'm the director of a program called Administrative Data Research UK, based in the UK, all around the UK, which is opening up access to government administrative data for research purposes. And those who are regular attenders at this conference will remember I gave a keynote speech at the conference last year on that. So lovely to be back, if virtually. But I'm just going to very quickly run round my panel members so that they can introduce themselves. And firstly, I'll go to Felix Ritchie, who should be on stage with you. So Felix, fire away.
Hello, yes, we still have a little problem with the sound, so we're just wandering around trying to sort things out, but yes. Can you hear us?
Okay. This is slightly odd because we can't hear Felix. But I've left a gap. Hopefully he's introduced himself. And if we can find a way of making sure that we can hear Felix, that would definitely improve the session going forward. But Steve, do you want to go next?
Yeah, Steve McCachran. I'm Director of the Australian Data Archive, based at the Australian National University in Canberra, Australia. I'm also the lead on a national social science infrastructure project here in Australia.
Excellent. And Maggie, do you want to go next? I think Maggie will also be on stage.
Yes, so
So you can't hear me, but hi, everybody. I'm Maggie Levenstein. I'm the director of ICPSR, and I'm which is the Inter-University
Again,
Consortium.
we can't hear Maggie, so hopefully Maggie has introduced herself now. Though.
Recording in progress.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So maybe I will try again. I'm Maggie Levenstein. I'm the director of ICPSR, and I am here to talk to you all today about the things that we're doing at ICPSR that are really very, I think, aligned with the kinds of things that you're going to hear about from UK Data Service and the Australians and others. And so I'm really happy to be able to talk to you about it. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And Kirsten, do you want to go next?
Hi all, I'm Kirsten Dutton. I'm from the Economic and Social Research Council in the UK, and I work in the Data and Infrastructure team, programme managing a big kind of scoping project called Future Data Services that I'll be talking about shortly, and also kind of involved in a big programme called Population Research UK.
Excellent, thanks Kirsten. And Lizzie, do you want to go next?
Yep, so hi everyone, I'm Elizabeth Green. I'm a lecturer at the University of the West of England. I work alongside Felix, and I'm also a strategic fellow for the Future Data Services programme within the ESRC.
Thanks very much. And last but definitely not least, Libby, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, my name is Libby Bishop, and I'm working at IASSIST, the Leibniz Institute for Social Research. I work there in coordinating international research infrastructures and have done a large EU, tiny part of a large EU project on sharing sensitive data and lead a team on metadata. So of course I'm interested in actually making FAIR actionable. Prior to coming to GESIS about 6 years ago, I was at the UK Data Archive, and they're working on integrating what was then new data types, namely qualitative data, into a survey environment. So I have a lot of thoughts about the challenges of new data services grappling with new data types like social media data, web scrape, and so forth, because I think we actually have a lot of experience handling non-traditional survey data that can be brought to bear on these matters. So in addition, I hope to bring a fairly international perspective, having from the US with a considerable time in the UK and now at GESIS. Thanks for having me.
Excellent, thanks very much. And now we've introduced the panel, we're just going to have a very short presentation, which is going to explain what the sort of context of what we're doing in the UK. And then I'll ask some questions myself of the panel, and then the final half hour will open up to audience questions. So please do put them in the Q&A if you're online, and we'll also have somebody in the room picking up questions as well. Yeah, do you want to go ahead with the short presentation, Kirsten, to explain the UK context?
Great, thank you, Emma. Thanks. So I will just give a bit of an introduction initially about the space that we work within, and within the UK and the kind of the more global landscape, and then talk more specifically about our work. So for those who aren't familiar, the Economic and Social Research Council, who are undertaking a big activity around future data services, are part of a wider organisation called UK Research and Innovation, who are responsible for delivering public funding for research across the kind of the full spectrum of disciplines. UK RISE existed for about 5 years now, and it kind of provides us quite a good and unique opportunity to work to enable research across disciplines, but also across the funders. And so we work quite closely with our counterparts. I'm within the data and infrastructure team, the counterparts within different councils, to come up with programs and approaches to investment, which are truly kind of cross-disciplinary, but also examine where some of the similarities and differences lie across different disciplines within the data landscape. This is a slightly chaotic slide that's somewhat deliberate. It's designed to kind of show just how kind of complicated the landscape that we work within is, and that you all work within. The centre are the investments that just my team are responsible for managing and investing in, and then additional ones from kind of across the rest of ESRC. As we get further out, we're looking at more kind of UK research and innovation projects that we are involved in, and then more national data landscape initiatives, and then more broadly kind of an international landscape. Please don't be offended if we haven't put where you're from on here. We've been trying to capture as we've been listening to talks over the last couple of days, we've been adding some in, but we won't have captured everybody. But we are always keen to hear from anybody working in this landscape about some of the needs and things like that. So please do get in touch. So the landscape that we work within, as you'll know, is kind of constantly changing. There's always new legal frameworks coming into existence, and those vary from country to country. There's changing technology, and that feels like it changes every kind of 5 minutes sometimes. There is kind of rapid and evolving differences in multidisciplinary research, and there's also lots of changing attitudes when it comes to data custodians, owners, policymakers, the public, and researchers themselves. And kind of the timing of this for us in the work that we're doing is associated with the fact that we have a number of investments that are due up, their grants will finish in the next 12 months or so. So it provides us quite a unique opportunity to kind of take a step back and look at the landscape and really establish what's needed from the community perspective, so from researcher perspective, from the services themselves, what investment is required to kind of really enable the next step in data services for particularly the UK social science community in this context. But we're keen to make sure that we're doing this within the global context. We've been doing loads of different stakeholder engagement. A lot of this will be kind of what you expect in a typical scoping programme. We've had lots of workshops, we've utilised lots of other people's workshops to get some evidence for ourselves, and we've also ran lots of our own. Some of these will be groups that you've heard about in the last 24 hours or so. So definitely the SDAP were mentioned yesterday. We're part of a wider programme of work in the UK for UKRI called the Digital Research Infrastructure, which funds a number of projects. And whilst we're not funded by them, we kind of link into them fairly substantially. We've run surveys, we have expert groups across a range of themes, and we run facilitated discussion sessions on Slack with them, which have been incredibly useful. And we hope they've been useful to the experts themselves in maybe creating some links. I think some of the experts are there, so hopefully they can answer that question. We've had interviews, we've got various governance groups, and starting next week, we have a series of reverse science cafes that hopefully Liza will be able to share a link for shortly, for people to be able to access. In terms of getting involved, we're happy to hear from anybody. Please do email us. These slides will be shared on Zenodo, hopefully, so you'll be able to get to that email address. So the framework that we work within is the ESRC data infrastructure strategy, which has a number of pillars. And from that, we have a series of themes that we're working within. So the first one is data access, user support and training, which fits quite nicely with the themes around leadership and connectedness, skills and capacity for data use. I should say that the strategy pillars are used to help guide some of our, the majority of our investments. We have discovery and data curation, which fits with building and sustaining a foundation in leadership and connectedness. We have technology. I went a bit overboard on the animation here, I think. Ethics, legal impact and public engagement, and people, organisation and culture. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the themes that have resulted from the work associated with this. I think I've just seen that the slide has disappeared off the screen. So I will just talk temporarily until it's reappeared. Yeah, I'm going to introduce some of the themes that have come up through evidence associated with work on these areas. There's one that we've been working predominantly up until this point. I'm going to actually unusually leave that for last. I'm going to go with the slightly lighter touch ones so far, and we'll be going into more detail working on those over the next sort of 6 to 9 months. So, in terms of the first theme, not the first theme, the data discovery and data curation, we're really conscious that for the whole kind of data services community and social science data as a whole, data is spread out. It's frequently quite challenging to locate. It's often duplicated in lots of different locations, and that causes lots of different issues from both a service perspective as well as a user perspective. And one of the things that we're kind of working around is what are the signposting needs for that data, what potential is there for one-stop shops rather than a multitude of catalogues, and what kind of the need for better search functions and harmonising terminology. As we go through these will be recurrent themes that you've seen over the last kind of 24 hours plus at the conference, hopefully. So in terms of technology, one of the areas that we've been focusing on is access to beyond desktop compute. We're conscious that there is a benefit to access to that compute power, which is now currently typically more accessible to particularly the physical sciences, within particularly the EQI context. And it's of benefit to both the researchers in terms of the research itself, but also to the services. So just yesterday, UKGS were talking about the potential of running risk analysis around combinations of different variables and the capacity that HPC would bring to that versus doing on kind of the compute that they currently have. What we also are kind of considering around beyond desktop compute is also kind of what's the appropriate level of these technologies that people have access to. So it's not just do people have access to things that they don't currently have access to, but actually how do we make sure that they're accessing the right level, that they're not vastly overgoing their needs and going for high performance computing when they really don't need high performance computing. And also not necessarily stuck on a laptop in a university when they need a high performance computer. Underneath these are just some ideas of kind of what we'll be doing in terms of stakeholder engagement coming soon, so please do get in touch if you want to get involved in anything. The next one is legal ethics, public engagement and impact. And from this one, we all know that ethical approvals varies vastly across different organisations and different countries because there's lots of different needs. However, I think we're really keen to establish what's that gold standard requirement for ethics. And that's a very big question, and that kind of links into this question of who makes that decision. So that's some of our scoping work has been around that and will continue to be so. And how do we make sure that we're engaging public panels and people like people from the public and across a range of kind of contributors to this space. The next one is people, organisation and culture. And in this context, we're talking more about the services themselves. And one thing we're particularly aware of in the UK, but I know it's an international issue as well, is that particularly data professionals within services, particularly in academic institutions, the capacity for progression and salaries that are potentially equivalent to something like industry is particularly challenging. So what we want to make sure is that we're looking at progression frameworks for those careers that maybe don't have them already, training opportunities, promotion opportunities, and also looking at how those roles are framed within an academic organisation and what opportunities we could provide, and how we could potentially, within the bounds of what we realistically can do, make things like the roles, and the benefits and the salaries more competitive. So moving on to the slightly more substantial one that we're working on at the moment, which is data access, user support and training. So similarly to discovery and data curation, we know that there's quite a variety of quite complex access routes to data. This can cause confusion and frustration for people who are, because it's complex, but also because they might have to do everything 3 times or more. There's a risk that systems might clash, or that there's pinch points and interdependencies between those systems. Similarly, there are lots of different accreditation processes for the people, the projects and the organisations across the international landscape. A lot of the decision making that happens to get that accreditation is quite dependent on small groups of people making those decisions, which obviously then has some limits in terms of availability and the speed with which things can happen. And we're looking at what the capacity is and the potential is for a universal application for accreditation and what that might look like if it were feasible. In terms of user support and training, we're conscious that data services providing user support and training, for them it's incredibly resource intensive, particularly where that's quite specialist support. And so there's the kind of resources that are more generally available, but a lot of that can be one-on-one time. So we're trying to look at that balance. We've currently got a survey out, so if you'd like a link for that survey, please do let me know via Slack. There's lots of barriers to access to training, particularly around cost and accessibility, and to providing it for the services on limited budgets. There's also quite a duplication of potential training opportunities out there. So we kind of want to look at where opportunities for streamlining might exist. And then finally, utilising feedback to inform support. We're very keen to make sure that what is being collected in terms of feedback is used to tailor support to inform the design of that support, and best practices developed that can be utilised further. So just quickly as a final thing, these are some very early, very draft recommendations that we will hopefully be publishing relatively soon for comment regarding data access, user support and training. So from the perspective of data access, we're talking things like, how do we make sure there's consistency of concepts across processes and documentation, so it's common frameworks, principles and best practice, and establishing a standardised accountability framework that would be established for all, in this case, UKRI data services, but obviously it would be preferable if that was broader beyond UKRI, to promote consistent reviewing and, where necessary, challenging of processes and functions. And then with regards to user support and training, we're very keen that there is KPIs and reporting for data services, which is very transparent and shares how user support feedback is used for developing those services. We're keen to explore, and this has come up definitely in previous talks over the last couple of days, the opportunities around a life course learning approach, including data-driven skills kind of across the full academic spectrum, and then also the opportunities around research training passport or a learning management system, which we need to kind of investigate further, and the capacity to link that to existing researcher accreditation and reporting systems. So, for example, ORCID, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. So I leave that with the question. So what does future data services look like? There's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but we're going to kind of open the floor to some questions now. So I'll hand back to Emma.
And thanks very much. That was a really, really good introduction to everything that's going on in the UK, and I'm sure will stimulate a lot of discussion amongst our panellists. And please do be thinking up your questions in the audience as well. And so, panellists, obviously you can refer to your own experience, but please do feel free to refer back to things that Kirsten mentioned in her talk as well. But as a first question, just thinking about training, how do you think we can better share good practice in data governance or researcher training at an international level? And I'll go to Felix on stage for this question first.
Okay. Thank you. Can you hear me okay online?
Yes.
And in the back of the room? Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you all. Yes. I mean, one of the reasons that we have this group together of Maggie and Steve and Libby all presenting with us here is because we're aware that there's a lot of stuff which is very similar in very different countries, that all of us have identified that one of the key issues there is thinking about training as a much more holistic approach. It's not about getting someone to do one thing, it's about seeing that there are, for example, career pathways, not just for the researchers, the sort of research passport that Maggie's been working on, to show, well, you know, you are available to do all these sorts of things, but also looking at the people who work in the laboratories. Are you an output checker? Are you a senior output checker? Are you someone who is a designer? Are you a data support person? And starting to understand that these things are sort of need to be integrated. And there's a lot of work which is currently going on at the moment. So Libby can talk about what's happening in Germany at the moment, quite an ambitious program to develop precisely this sort of global program. Steve is doing the same thing in Australia, and we're slightly running behind to catch up with what's being had in those other areas. But I think it's a recognition, not just that a common view that what we need to be doing is pushing this common approach, but also starting to think about how do we make sure we don't duplicate stuff. For example, if a researcher in the UK has gone through what's called the Safe Researcher Training, which gives you access to all of the secure facilities, do they need to do through that again if they want to use the facilities in Germany? Should we have comparability of training results? So this idea about how we can create an entire program of training is not just within a country, it also needs to be cross-country and have that awareness that the academic world is not individual country units. People move around. Let's see if we can take advantage of that.
Thanks very much, Felix, and you make some really good points there. And yeah, appreciate that in the UK that we are probably behind the curve here because, for example, you know, we've got 4 constituent countries to the UK. Quite often the rules and the training, you know, can differ across those 4 countries. But really welcome thoughts from first Libby on this and then Steve.
Hi, thanks everybody. I mean, I don't know as we're ahead, so I'm not even going to go into the game of who's leading or not here. Germany has got its own set of challenges. We've got a highly distributed group of research data centers. In fact, the entire, of course, even government structure in Germany is highly decentralized, which adds a layer of complexity to handling these issues of training. I am increasingly skeptical, of sort of a solution that is going to be, it's all going to be integrated somewhere. I'm leaning toward thinking it's going to be back to metadata and findability. So how do we keep track of what's going on elsewhere in an attempt to avoid this sort of duplication? I mean, I'll put the link in the chat. One of the projects I did with CESDA, which is a consortium for European social science data archives, was put together a really basic, primer website of some things that people who are starting to work in data archives want to know about. Why do you need a policy? What is FAIR? What is the, OAIS model? Just 4 or 5 chapters on basic sorts of things. But just the investigation to figure out what was going on in Germany with other kinds of training programs, never mind what was going on with, half the acronyms that were on one of those earlier slides with Research Data Alliance, with CODATA, with digital preservation, never mind that university programs are starting as well. So, unfortunately, I don't have solutions here unless we begin with an idea of like a repository for training things so that we can begin to find each other at least, or, a place where you can go to register your own, or we just give up and don't worry about duplication. I'm not sure, but I also do know there is an incredible amount of wasted resources, and I don't think the funders are going to be happy with that forever. In fact, they're already not happy with it. So either we solve it or they'll solve it for us, and I think we're better off if we find the answer. Anyway, more issues with the challenges than the solution there, but that's where my head is at for now.
All very good points though, Lizzie, and over to you, Steve.
Yeah, so I wouldn't disagree with anything that's been said so far. I think probably what I'd pick up on a little bit is you've got to have mechanisms for coordination of that. And I think that sort of sits in two ways. One is we've got to agree on what the sort of a common framework and, common content might be. And I know amongst the data access professionals group, there's sort of kind of been discussion about, what the sort of core content or a framework for content might be, which is a good starting point there. The other thing to me, and this is sort of the effort that I've been working on more, is if you have it and you've done it, you've got to have a means of exchanging that information effectively. So as I say, while it's nice to say I've done this training, it's nice to not have to say I've done this training, that we already know that. Picking up on some of the, say the researcher passport models, well, that's something you should be able to, add on to a passport, and it should be able to be moved between systems automatically. So we've got to make better use of that information that already exists and can be known, and be able to move it around effectively. That probably has some, from the work that we've done, has some implications for how you run some of that training and where you provide those resources. We've been testing learning management systems and see if we can exchange, between systems, and it becomes a bit of a pain. So there's probably going to have to be a bit of compromise, but it is something actually that would probably aggregate quite well on a consortium, a national sort of, or international level, consortium model. If we agree on, okay, this is the set of platforms we're going to use, same way as being discussed on, TREs and things like that, then you might have a model for saying, well, okay, if those are the systems being used, then we can establish standards. We know how to move data around. Let's find the means for doing so that, and this is a repeated problem in some of the other spaces as well around access too.
And just thinking more about standards and how related to how trusted research environments operate. So next question is, how do we make standards?
Emma, before we go on, can I just talk a little bit, because Libby was saying she didn't have a solution, and I actually think we do have a solution, and we've been talking around the solution. But ICPSR has been for a number of years working on a researcher passport. Allison Tyler, who was a graduate student at the University of Michigan, where ICPSR is based, did research about 5 years ago looking at the differences in how we talk about and how we measure data confidentiality and what the requirements are for access to data are in different data archives around the world. And she's now at the UK Data Archive, which is wonderful because it really helps to establish that kind of collaboration. But ICPSR has launched a researcher passport. What it is right now is kind of a shell, but it does allow you to use an API to bring in evidence of your training using things like CITI and peers, which at least in the United States are fairly common learning management systems for doing this kind of online training. By the end of this year, we will have a more robust system that we're working on. And we're working on it right now. We've also created a shared application system for restricted data that we built for the U.S. federal statistical community. I mean, unlike some countries, the U.S. is very, very decentralized. So there are, I think, 18 different federal statistical agencies that are all now using something called ResearchData.gov, which is the single place to apply for access to restricted data from the federal government in the United States. And by the end of this year, we'll be using basically the same technology, the same application system to apply for all restricted access data from ICPSR, and then you'll be able to pull information from the researcher passport into that application so that it pulls all the information available. One of the things that we're really trying to do with both of these systems is to have them metadata driven, so the information about what do we need to know about you in order to apply for a particular data set should be based on the data that you're actually applying for, because different data sets have different requirements, different legal and ethical requirements, different standards for access, different training requirements. So I think that we are trying very hard to develop this in a way that will be useful and interoperable to other archives in the community. But I think one of the things I think is most important about this discussion today and every day is to make sure that as we are each working on these things, we are aware and we're doing them in ways that are interoperable so that we are not simply, wasting scarce resources, doing the same thing over and over again. I was on a National Academies panel once in which someone said, fair is our goal, but far seems to be what we often end up with, because that interoperability part of it is the biggest challenge. And so I'm hoping that this discussion is kind of part of building that awareness so we understand what other archives need, and you understand what we need and what we're doing that might be useful to you. So I think that I think there really is a very broad understanding, and has been for a while, that we need a digital credential that is accepted across archives, not just across countries, but within countries. As we were talking about for Germany or the US, even different archives within the country are going to have different standards, and we really need to be able to do this. Having that shared, having a single passport that is commonly accepted not only streamlines the process for researchers, it also allows us to reinforce the norms that we want about a culture of confidentiality and respect for the individuals that are represented in the data that we're working with. And I think that we can sort of build that into the researcher passport, build those values into how we share data, because you also not only have evidence for your training, but you can have evidence, you can show how you've used data responsibly in the past. If you have a history of sharing your own data, so it's not just are you using other people's data, but are you being a good data steward? And actually also, have you been irresponsible? And is that something that somebody should know about in using your data? So I think that we can really use a researcher passport both to streamline data access and to create a shared understanding of what responsible data access is. The other thing I wanted to say about training, which I think is really important, I don't know about elsewhere in the world, but in the United States at least, I must do a dozen click-through trainings, more than that, right? Between the university and the federal data system, because we work very closely with the Census Bureau and other statistical agencies. I do a lot of click-through online trainings about this and that and this and that, and my fingers have gotten really fast at doing this. And what we want people to learn is not how to click quickly, but how to assimilate and embrace the values that we want. And those values are about protecting confidentiality. They are about responsible data management. They're also about ethical use of data. And I think that this is, as we're going to continue to talk, becomes extremely important as we increasingly talk about non-design data, found data, digital footprints data, as they're calling it in the UK. I like that. That sounds more magical than than non-design data. But anyway, those data are incredibly valuable, but they are often not representative of the population. And so we really need to teach people to think about how to use that ethically, both to protect confidentiality, but also to make sure that we are drawing inference in a way that is appropriate, that we're making sure that the people that we're talking about are actually represented in the data that we use, and that's we have to do that much more intentionally when we're just using found data, where it looks like it's so big we don't have to think about anything. And I think part of ethical data use really is about, and this is actually very consistent with the theme of this conference, that ethical data use isn't just about protecting confidentiality. It's also about making sure that the data are representative of the people that we're speaking about and we're making inference about. And I think we need to be building all of that into the training. The last thing I want to say about clicking training is I think we need to be more creative about our training, so that it's not just click, 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 that it is more interactive. Even if it's online, it is about people talking together about these shared values. And I think that will help people to internalize and embrace these values in a more fundamental way than simply individually going through and clicking through. So I think we need to have some creative pedagogy about how we do this kind of training so that it actually builds the culture of responsible data management that we want.
It's okay. We've solved that one. Okay.
All really good points. I just want to move on to the next question. I've got a whole list of questions. I'm never going to get through them all, but I just want to keep going with a couple, because just thinking about standards that relate to how trusted research environments operate. Lizzie, could I come to you next? And I know you'd have thought about this in the future data services work that you've been doing, but how do we make standards achievable internationally to make data more discoverable and accessible? And this is not about the researcher training, it's about how the trusted research environments themselves actually operate.
Well, this is a bit of a controversial question, because obviously I'm not an expert in running TREs. One thing I would say, having spoken to a number of different TREs and worked with a number of different TREs internationally, obviously good transparency is key. Having that conversation with PPI is significantly important, and beginning to foster a community approach in that the researchers become embedded within the organization itself, which can be quite difficult to do, but they become embedded almost within the philosophy and the ethics of what the TRE is trying to achieve. So everyone has the same goal. Now this is a dream world. Will we ever get there? It is difficult to say. And I think as well, it is important to understand the unique context in which specific international TREs may be found facing and so forth, and making sure that solutions are adapted to each context. So I think similar to the 5 safes is that it's a framework you can use and apply to any organization, to any data issue, and you can develop a very nuanced context specific solution using that framework. Maybe we need to come up with a standardized framework in which TREs can then adopt.
Very good point, Lizzie. And just going quickly on to the next question, because I've got some very specific questions for some of the panel members. So the next question is, and this relates to something that Kirsten touched on in her presentation. Are the large-scale compute requirements of social science changing? And how do we ensure that everyone can access them when needed? And I'll go to Steve first with this one.
Are they changing? This is say I see in the chat someone Stefan's brought up HPC. Which is high performance computing. I have my doubts as to the demands for actual HPC in the social sciences, as those who actually run HPC systems would conceive of it. To the extent that we need real high performance computing, I think is there are some problems that are that exist in the social sciences. Where that matters, but and they will continue to emerge, and they will probably actually emerge in the digital footprints sort of space, I think, sooner rather than later. But for the most part, it's actually not it's not HPC that we need. But it is getting off the desktop, and it's for 2 reasons. One is that we have for the trusted research environments are basically getting off the desktop. Fundamentally, we can't be bringing things. The second thing is we do need to scale. We actually scale in a different way. We've got to roll up, virtual machines, operate them, for a fixed period of time, and then switch them off again. It's actually very bursty, and for most of the problems that we're dealing with, not computationally intensive. I'm not, that's not across the board, and it will continue to. You'd expect to see that more will grow, but for the sort of computation we need, it's actually being able to get access to on-demand, sort of the cloud edge computing, rather than the actual high-performance computing, which I think is probably the more likely case in the medium term. As I say, that's a bit of a generalisation, but realistically, there's probably not a lot where actual HPC is really going to be demanded. And the other problem with HPC that exists is the security problems that we have in the social sciences are not really well dealt in the HPC community. They're oriented towards open and accessible data. The only place I've really seen it being done with any serious considerations is in the Netherlands. Some very, very interesting things happening in the IASSIST group.
And hold that thought, because, right, so my next question is one for, I'm going to go to Maggie for. So are data science techniques and methods an opportunity or a threat to social science?
Well, so I would say everything is an opportunity. That's my general approach to the world, I suppose. I was listening to what Steve was saying, and I was thinking, it is. I guess I agree if you mean most social scientists are not using high performance computing and and certainly most already minted social scientists are not going to need high performance computing. My graduate students use high performance computing all the time. And I think sometimes it's because of the size of the data, and sometimes it's because of the computational intensity. So I think that we're going to see this. I think that we will continue to see more data science methods used in the social sciences. I think it's actually incredibly important that the social sciences pay attention to this, because there are data scientists who don't know anything about social science, who don't know anything about social theory, who don't know anything, and they don't think that they need to, because they think that if you just have enough data that it doesn't matter. And I think that that's a mistake. And so I think it's really important that we not just cede that space to people who have not thought about social theory and won't understand things that are very basic, like, is this representative of a population? You end up with unethical and incorrect analyses if you do it that way, if you don't understand how social systems work. So I think it's important that social scientists engage with this rather than just sort of assume it's not relevant to us. In terms of, I wasn't sure what Steve was saying when he said that I think it is possible, and it is in fact critical that we make use of secure cloud computing where that is appropriate. And again, that's not what's necessary for everyone, but I don't actually think that it's technologically that challenging, that in fact it is the communities, if you look at the military communities, they are doing this already. They are using this all the time, and they do analyses which we might think of as social science analyses, and they do it in secure computing spaces. So I think that there is the technological challenge to doing secure high performance computing is actually largely met. The questions are about access, about the funding models, about having the technological training to access those things. And I think that those are things that we're going to have to continue to address. And I think Felix has been thinking about that.
I was just going to add one thing on that.
I know. I want to come to Felix in a minute, because I think there's some very relevant things going on in the UK around this debate. But first, I want to go to Steve, because he's very politely been sitting there with his hand up. Go ahead, Steve.
I don't disagree with anything that Maggie just said. I think my point was more around matching the computing requirements to the need. What we don't want to do is turn up and say we could very easily blow out basically the computation budget in the HPC systems with things that don't need it. So it's really about appropriate use of scarce resources. For our economist friends in the room. So as I say, a lot of the problems we don't need, aren't going to need HPC. There are some that are, and making sure that we're actually able to provide an infrastructure sort of a national and international level that matches the problem and matches the computational and data requirements to the sorts of computation that we're talking about, as I say. And, so what's available needs to be well aligned with the sort of computation that happens on those different sorts of systems. Because what we really don't want is mismatches, because that's a very good way to get funders offside as well, is to waste the what are highly competitive and in demand environments.
Yeah, thanks very much. And Felix, I just want to stretch this question a little bit further by posing the next question to you. What can data scientists learn from social researchers in this space?
Well, I think in terms of what Maggie said, one of the important points is there is doing the statistics and there is understanding the context for it. So that is where I think it comes back to thinking about, do you understand what you're doing? And it's not just even as simple as is it representative, but it's thinking about, well, okay, is the way that you're doing the information likely to, for example, disadvantage a particular group? And we've seen this in lots of cases with the with badly advised AI applications, which have built in them, say, racist configurations. So I think this is where we might think that perhaps the important point is understand this. And this, I think, is a wider discussion that I'm very keen that when we think about these things, we know how to do everything. Everything you can think of in doing this and protecting and using this data has been done somewhere by someone, and maybe you'll find a better way to do this. But basically, we know how to do everything. The big issues are about how do we do it better and how do we do it ethically. As we're getting more and more uses of data, more and more different ways, then that understanding of what is an appropriate use, is this a sensible thing we should be doing on there, are going to loom larger, because there are lots of technical, practical questions, but we can address those, and we only need to worry about whether we can address them better. Even on things like security of the data, again, we know how to do all of that. There's different configurations, but I'm not particularly bothered about that. What I am interested in is, for example, who has access to the data and what are they using it for? That's the question which is going to be important in the future, rather than can we manage that securely? That's been done.
Yeah, very, very good point. So, Libby, do you want to round off this question with your response? I think you're still on mute. Sorry.
Still can't learn. Somebody posed the question, what can data scientists learn from social scientists? I agree with that. We've got a lot to share. I'm working in an organization that is easily, I don't know the proportions, but it's a pretty big mix of computational social scientists, but pure comp tech people and social scientists. We're just integrating 30 or 40 new people broadly, from much more from the computational technical side than from the social scientists. And unless we frame this debate also as what social scientists can learn from computational social scientists, we will not end up with, I think, the outcome that I want as much as you do, Maggie, which is a much better appreciation of the kind of ethical and broader social implications of what we're doing. But if we come at this thinking we are the font of the knowledge, we won't get there. So it's a hard lesson to learn. I am spending so many hours in meetings defining metadata from a computational social science perspective, and it is not what I think is metadata. But I've got to give, because we won't go anywhere if I don't give a little. Okay.
So I actually completely agree with that, Libby. I'm one of the challenges that really is an exercise in translation, these kinds of conversations, and we have to take the time to have them, because we often don't realize that we're using words in different ways. I completely agree. But that's what I have graduate students
Absolutely.
for.
And one of the sort of observations I've made between what we think about as digital footprints data in the UK and the type of data that I work with, which is sort of individual level administrative data linked to many other data sets, is that data scientists, it's all about, web scraping and sort of reusing the data that's already out there. It's not necessarily working within a trusted research environment. So I can see there's a kind of bit of a culture clash potentially around, this push towards more open science, but really welcome views of the panel around thinking, obviously, openness and transparency is a good thing, but clearly there's a balance with the type of data that you're working on. But do any panel members have thoughts on that? Steve, go ahead first.
Yeah, actually, before you even got into the end of the sentence, I say it was something I kind of wanted to pick up on already, which was we're talking a lot about researchers and research environments, but actually I think that's the wrong way to conceive of the ecosystem and the services that we're thinking about here. And in a sense, the UK have given put some effort into this, which is to think about administrative data, consumer data, government data, and the like. Those, one of the translation efforts that I think is somewhat challenging is between it. I think in the first instance, it's academic and government. I come out of a business school originally. I'm used to working with private sector data, but that just gets even worse. Let's say, but dealing at least with those places where we do crossover, the government's sources of data, and they are also users of data, and the consistency of the inconsistency and both the cultural and the translational differences between just those two sectors create some of the challenges that I think that we have in place. And it's because there's different incentives that exists there. Openness is good, and transparency is good, but has its limits, and the research sector is far more oriented towards openness and transparency because of the incentives we have than is the case in government. Despite best intentions, there are always going to be things that are behind closed doors, and how do you balance those effectively? And that and so things like the work Maggie's done on the Research Data Gov access. Similarly, some of the work we've done, some of the heavy lifting is just consistency between just those two sectors. Initially, before we start getting into the other, the private sector, considerations, just multiply those issues.
Yeah, and Maggie, do you want the final word on this question before we move on?
So a couple things I'm not sure I'm quite responsive to what you're saying. There are a couple things I was thinking about. One is I think private sector data is actually extremely important, and I think we need to change norms to sort of make it clear that private sector data should be available in a responsible way for research for scientific purposes. And one of the things we've actually are pushing the University of Michigan to do is to take a stand regarding the terms of service that some data providers impose on researchers, which undermine basic values of transparency, reproducibility, confidentiality protection, and representativeness. And I actually I have basically stopped using the term open science because I think it is often misleading. We want research, and we want scientific research that is transparent. We want scientific research that is reproducible. We want scientific research that is ethical and representative but I think open, people think that means that it is just open to the world, and that is often not ethical or responsible. So I actually just stay away from using that term because I think it often is misleading.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And just moving on to the next question, and Steve, I'm going to come to you first with this one. Do you think that public trust in opening up data for research purposes has changed as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yes. I'd say, we've done a bit of work at the centre that I work in, Centre for Social Research and Methods. We've been kind of tracking trust and trust in data sharing, trust in institutions and the like. Following this period, I mean, the Australian case is not a great one to look at because we had some fairly challenging issues back in 2016. Our census landed on the front page of the New York Times for all the issues that we had. So we've had a very interesting dynamic in terms of the trusted, in data sharing that's gone on. I would say, so what it suggested is people became more aware of the benefits of sharing data. Certainly as the COVID period went on, but it's not it's not straightforward. Not long after, we actually had a number of private sector data breaches, which then pushed us probably backwards for a period. They also to sort of look at the fine grain aspects of it, they also found that alongside with understanding there are benefits to sharing data, just finding out just how much can be known about you, puts reservations on there. Interestingly, though, that the one of the related things we found was that trusted institutions continue to be trusted institutions. So if you have a role as a type of institution in society that's responsible for conducting research, that actually that trust has been maintained and even increased somewhat over the period. So it's not entirely a single message that's there, but it did open people's eyes to just understanding both some more of the pros and actually more of the cons of sharing that result from that. So that creates an interesting dynamic for the sort of the public engagement.
Yeah, and certainly in the UK, just raising the level of awareness around data being used for research has really helped programs like ADI UK, because we can talk much more sort of concisely about the missed use of data. So if someone's paid to link data, create a research data set, but it's held just within a research group, then that's a missed use of data for the wider research community. And I think we're pretty good at this generally in the UK about opening up that secure access to that data. But it certainly helped us with conversations with data owners about, that's just no longer acceptable. But Libby, I'd be really interested in your views on this, because I'm sure you've got some sort of views differing across potentially Germany and the UK on this as well.
Yeah, thanks. Well, let me comment on that briefly, but come back to a different point on trust, actually. So, yes, I mean, it's been an eye-opening experience being here in Germany under what is actually a stricter data security regime, even than the General Data Protection Regulation, although they're closely aligned. But that's actually not my deep expertise, so I'm going to shirk away from that and circle back to the high-level trust issue. The entire foundation on which we can work is trust. I mean, if I learned one thing from Matthew Woolard at UK Data Service, it's that's what it means to be producing data that other people trust as what it says on the tin, that it's the same when it started from the archive as when it gets to you as a download. The whole thing is built on trust. I just read a paper published in Patterns, which is a subjournal of the Cell, that successfully produced and published a completely synthetic research paper with data using, you guessed it, of course, ChatGPT. Now, I doubt that it's actually true quite yet, but it's going to be true soon. That's we are close enough to fabricating data, and it's going to be really hard to tell the difference soon. So, I'm not trying to do the scaremongering thing, because I think there is way too much of that going on with the entire AI world right now. But I think we have got to figure out what it means to get back to first principles around trust and trustworthiness, or our enterprise will not hold together, because that's what it's, what it is built on. And that's why I circle around to my points where, I know Maggie and I, agree so much with it. It sounds fuzzy. These aren't easy things to measure, but across the work Maggie's doing, I learned it from Felix too. We need to build a moral community around better use of data, and what that means to use even difficult, challenging, sensitive data for the public good. And that isn't going to happen with the simplicity of codes of conduct or ethics review boards, even though all those things may be important. That is part of building the conversation in the same way that these challenges, and I do think the historical examples are relevant about what happened with finally getting toward control of nuclear weapons and nuclear power, of what actually finally happened to slow down some of the race around genetic research and genetic modification and the use of CRISPR technologies. These, I think, are the models that we're actually looking at now for dealing with our environment, because the threats, I don't think, are actually what's on the front pages of the paper, of the newspapers, but around trustworthiness of information. Data is a kind of information. That's where our battle is.
No, completely agree with that. And the final
Emma.
question before I go to audience
Emma.
questions, and I do want to leave some time for that. And Felix, I'm going to come to you next. Do you think there's opportunities for greater legal and ethical coordination in social science data research at an international level?
Was that for me? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Sorry. Okay. Well, we'll come back to you. Yes, there is, but it's not legal coordination. One of the things is we focus too much on the laws for this. When we're trying to talk to people about designing processes, ignore the laws. What you should be thinking about is the ethics. Meeting law is one of the things you do, but all data protection laws are there to allow you to explain to you how to do things. People get very confused. They think we can't do this. I've had conversations with so many people in so many different countries saying we can't do this because the law won't do this. And it's never, apart from in one case, turned out that the law can't do this. It always turns out that we don't want to do this. Okay, that's the whole point. Data protection laws tell you how to do stuff. Now, can we coordinate? Yes, we can. But the thing is, again, we need to stop thinking about the law on this. What we need to think about is what are we trying to achieve? And this will be something, this is directly relevant, because what we're trying to produce as part of the future data services is not just a lot of the technical things which Kirsten will show you. We're trying to look at the underlying concepts and the way we think about things. Moving from a default closed option where we don't do anything to default open where we do things unless we can't do that. And this is about what we might move to a principles-based system. In other words, what are we trying to achieve? Okay, that's where we want to be. How do we get there? Rather than saying, this is where we are, what can we do with that? Now, that's a much more useful process and takes you in more useful ways. But it also means that if you know that's where I want to be, how do I get there? There might be multiple solutions through that. And we can also all say, yes, we all want to be in the same place. So we might have different laws. But actually, the laws pretty much work the same way when you look at them across countries and within countries. There's a lot of similarity in those things because what we're all trying to do is the same sort of thing. Okay, so let's focus. What are we trying to do when we want to do this, when we're sharing data? Can we set up our principles about how we're going to share that information? Because we can do that, and if we can agree what we're trying to achieve, then saying, okay, so this is where I want to be. How do I do this that's consistent with the laws that relate to my particular country, for example? That means we can then have multiple different solutions to the same outcome on here. We talked about training earlier. So there are different training needs in different countries and different standards, for example. But, for example, someone who is trained and a competent user of a secure research facility like the UK Data Lab, Secure Lab, okay, well that should be translatable because we understand the principles of what that person has been trained in. Specific use of that, it's different. We've seen examples of this. Lizzie and I run courses in training researchers using confidential data, in data governance, and in output checking. And one of the things that we've been doing this year is we've been taking our course from the UK and transplanting it to Nepal and applying it there. Now, Nepal is completely different from the UK in so many different aspects of it. Completely different legal framework, different IT infrastructure, different backgrounds, different culture. But the stuff that we do translates pretty easily. And that's because when we teach them about, for example, about management of confidential data, we tell them nothing about the laws. We tell them about this is what you're trying to achieve when you're doing this. This is what makes you a good, trusted researcher to work with confidential data. This is how producing good outputs. That has nothing to do with the specific legal framework, but it's, again, what we're trying to achieve on this. So going back to your question, Emma, yes, we can do a lot more international coordination, but what that needs to do is to get people to step away from saying, this is what I do, how does it differ from yours, to saying, this is where we want, let's agree where we want to be, and then we can all make our paths there based upon our own knowledge, and that gives us our common output, but it doesn't constrain us all to have to work in the same way.
Thanks very much. And Libby, come to you next.
Yeah, thanks. Just a quick follow-on. I'm sorry, something's happening with my browser and I can't grab a link, but I put a comment in the chat. The European Digital Media Observatory, EDMO, one of my colleagues here at GIESSIS, Katrin Veller, is in a particular working group that is working on negotiating access to platform data for social science research. So I just wanted to chime in and reinforce Steve's, well, everybody's points that this is about challenging the indisputability of legal terms and whether or not it is appropriate to do that, and whether or not with sufficient ethical reasoning, I would come back to this point, ethical grounds, public good, no other ways to do the data. You know, there are strong principles from unconsented research in the past that come into play here. There can be grounds for challenging terms of service. And we have, I think, been too timid perhaps for good legal reasons, but the time has come to challenge the platforms, I think, on what they are trying to do. I'll stop.
Thanks very much. And right, so we'll go to audience questions now. Felix, I'll be relying on you to spot any hands going up in the audience.
It's okay. We have the roving mic. I have it turned on. There. It's not working very well. Can you hear the mic?
We can hear you online.
Okay, that's what matters. Okay, so there's a question here up front.
Oh, hi, it's Darren Bell from UK Data Service. I'm feeling vaguely cheated. I've attended a session on future data services, and we've talked a lot about current challenges and issues, and that's been very interesting. But I haven't heard a single instance of a potential future data service such that in 5 years' time, a researcher would be able to do something of real value that they cannot do now. Have you got an example of a future data service of that kind?
Right, quick answers. Libby's got a hand up.
Yeah,
so
Darren, you're building one with the use of, for example, wait, I haven't had it, I wanted to get it into a comment, with the example of things like the digital privacy access vocabulary stuff that you're working with. That's exactly the kind of standard that needs to be there. So just say more about that.
So
excellent.
Can
I mean, yes, Libby. I mean, me and Libby know each other very well, but really, I'm asking the panel: can you give me, an example, a compelling example of a thing that a researcher will be able to do, or we'd like them able to do in 5 years' time that they cannot do now?
So
Maggie, over to you.
Yeah, so can I say a couple things? So at ICPSR, we're also standing up. We have something called the SOMAR, the Social Media Archive, which is hosting both platform data from various social media companies and surveys that are done on social media platforms. The data are all restricted, but it is, I think it's probably pretty similar to the things that GASIS has been working on. We're also, as both SOMAR and and the researcher passport, or something which we're developing, is which we call the research data ecosystem, which is designed to facilitate the kinds of things that I think researchers want to do, which involve integrating data of different types at different scales in a safe way. And that requires, and that I think often it requires a couple things. One is it requires being able to not bring all the data into one place, but being able to bring compute to the data rather than the other way around. And that is one of the things that we're hoping to be able to achieve with our with part of the RDE. I think that will actually be quite different than what any of us is doing right now. So I think that is what is going to be necessary, particularly when we talk about using private sector data that's held by private companies. And I don't just mean social media companies, I mean companies, like Amazon and Walmart, who actually have enormous amounts of information about the economic and social activity of all of us, and they're analyzing it. Amazon is now the largest employer of economists in the United States, and they are analyzing our economic activity all the time, but that data is not transparent, it's not reproducible, it's not science, it's analysis, but it's not science because it is being done inside the company for its purposes. And I think that we need to be able to I think in order, the future of data services really has to be addressing those kinds of challenges. And I actually think that this gets back to the question about where are we post-COVID. I think we saw post-COVID both the value of data sharing, that we were able to understand the disease because people were sharing data around the world, but also we saw the challenge why it's really, really important to be able to understand human behavior and not just the biology of the disease. And sharing data about human behavior is more challenging, but it is also where the lack of trust comes in. And I hope that the lack of trust is not as bad in other countries as it is in the United States, but it's a very serious problem here.
So I'm going to give Lizzie the last word on this question before we move to the next audience question. Lizzie, what is your vision for future data services in 5 years' time?
Well, I could just be the inner researcher in me, could be a bit catty and say, well, I'd like it that when I make an application to access for sensitive microdata, it is processed within the 6-week time frame. That would be fantastic, and not take 6 months as it did last year. Likewise, I would like to see more involvement in terms of more novel data sets, such as medical imaging, such as qualitative data, social media data, being able to access, utilize these functions would be fantastic.
Emma, can I come in?
Nothing small, but really quickly, Felix, because I do want to have another audience question as well.
Emma, can I come in? Yeah, I mean, I do have a clear vision of what a future data service looks like. I don't know what a specific future data service looks like, but I can tell you. That was my question. I know, but what I'm going to know is what we're trying to do here is it will have quite different feel to it if we can get things changed. And what it will be is, first of all, it'll be principles based, trying to work again from where we want to be rather than where we're back. It'll be evidence based. In other words, we know an awful lot about how to manage data. Let's start using that information. It'll be user centered rather than, for example, data owner centered, which it is at the moment. We're going to have a much more sensible view of risk management on this. It'll be default open. In other words, we do things unless we find a reason we can't do them, rather than the current view, which is generally we think, are we allowed to do this? We should be thinking, let's do that unless we can change. And although Kirsten talked about quite a lot of specific things on here, this is one of the underlying things we're trying to do, is actually change that fundamental approach. When you gave your summary yesterday, one of the things you highlighted was the role of data owners. Again, it's something which keeps coming up time and time again. They have enormous control over the way things are managed, and it's not necessarily a very positive influence. Let's move it away from saying, okay, this is what we should be doing. Why do we not challenge that hegemony over both the input and the output phrases? Because experience tells us in the past, when we do challenge that, data owners don't like the decisions we put on them either. They don't like having to make decisions on this, but no one thinks to actually ask them and say, well, this is a good thing. Do you want to do this? We go to them and we say, what do you think you should do? So I can say the characteristics of a future data service ideally are going to be quite different. I don't know what it'll actually do because I don't know that, but that's my evolved.
Can I just put one word out there, which we've been using increasingly? It's called post-custodial data management. And it is in terms of just, instead of thinking about things as who's the data custodian and how do they control things, thinking about a world in which we're moving beyond that data custody model.
Right, next question, audience, fire away.
Thanks very much. I'm Jeff Moon from Compute Ontario, and I've just recently moved from being a data librarian to being more of an HPC support person in the RDM context. And I listened with some interest, dare I say, a debate between Libby and Steve, I think, around the appropriateness of introducing social science researchers to high-performance computing. And I realize it's a scarce resource, but my question to you is there some value in intentionally introducing social science researchers to HPC, even if they don't fully completely need it, just to sort of till the field a little bit and make it more likely that they'll use it in the future once they've seen the potential?
I'm going to go to Steve first because he kicked off this debate to start with, and then I'll go to Maggie. Go ahead.
Yes. As I say, I mean, in a sense, you've got to start with the sort of compute requirements generally that then sort of form the foundation for HPC. I think, as I say, where I would be trying to till the field is what are those problems that that are likely to be in the future where HPC is likely to be required, and start working with researchers dealing with those sorts of problems and training those researchers. So, as Maggie said, some of her graduate students are doing this. What are the type of problems that they're dealing with, and target those communities where, as I say, it's either for high computational complexity or data scale that you can envisage a future where that's likely to be the case, and that's where I'd be targeting first. Now, so I don't know that specifically which researchers or which research problems that's going to be, but you can kind of envisage what it might be and start there.
Thanks very much. Over to you, Maggie.
Well, so obviously I would say yes, it's extremely important for people to understand data science approaches, and that's important for social scientists, both if they're going to use data science approaches and if they're not, they're just going to have discussions. It's in the same way I think it's really important for people who do qualitative research also to learn quantitative methods so that they don't just kind of go, oh, that's what you do, and not be able to engage in discourse about this. So I think it's very important for people to learn it. I also think that there are lots and lots of domains in which this is becoming important, both because of computational intensity. All of the work on privacy and differential privacy is very, very computationally intensive. If you want to participate that, if you want to improve it, and if you want to create alternatives to it, you have to be able to. You're going to be using data science methods, and you're going to be using a lot of compute. We have, whether it's education data, we have a new data infrastructure that we've just released at ICPSR called College and Beyond 2, which is built from college transcript records for thousands and thousands of students from multiple institutions. And it also includes survey data, but it includes every single course that they took, and you can look at networks, who takes classes together. People who do network analysis need more computation. The data are large. What people are doing with it is different. And I think that there's, whether people are looking at geospatial stuff, whether they're turning qualitative data into quantitative data with a kind of analyses of language, all of that is very computationally intensive and uses large data sets, and we need to have the compute infrastructure accessible and manageable in an affordable way that to support the research. And that is part of what archives are going to have to facilitate, and that's part of why I was talking about bringing compute to data as well.
And thanks very much. And we are 1 minute until out of time, so that's perfect timing. And it was an incredibly lively discussion. So thank you very much, Kirsten, for kicking us off with your presentation. And thank you for all of the audience with some great questions, and the panel for contributing all of your ideas and thoughts. And yeah, I hope the audience found that as interesting as I did. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. So we have the business lunch now in the ballroom.